He didn't scream when they handcuffed him. Didn't flinch when the grocery owner shouted, "Thief!" loud enough for the whole street to hear. Just stood there, coat thin as paper, holding nothing but a bruised apple and a stale roll tucked under his arm. His eyes hollow, his back still straight, like a soldier left behind on his own battlefield. Raymond Carter didn't beg for mercy, didn't try to run, didn't even speak. But when the judge opened, that manila file and a scratched military dog tag slipped onto the bench, the entire courtroom stopped breathing. The gavel never fell. The judge rose in silence. And when the crowd finally stood, it wasn't for the verdict. It was for the man they had all failed to see. This isn't a story about petty theft. It's about what a nation forgets when it stops looking its veterans in the eye. So stay with this story, because some silences deserve to be broken. Type honor if you believe in those who never asked for applause. And if you still think dignity is worth fighting for, then this channel was made for you. Raymond Carter was 67, but time had carved far more than years into his frame. His shoulders, once broad beneath a Marine's dress blues, now slumped beneath a frayed canvas jacket 2 sizes too large. His beard, peppered with white and rust, hung unevenly beneath hollow cheeks, and his eyes, steel blue, faded but unbroken, watched the world not with fear, but with a tired, wary pride. Every morning, just after sunrise, he would sling a weathered duffel over one shoulder and walk the same quiet circuit through the cracked sidewalks of Fair Haven, past the shuttered factory gates, the graffiti-stained bus depot, the same broken fire hydrant on 3rd and Act. He never begged, never even asked. He collected aluminum cans, flattened them carefully with the heel of a boot that leaked when it snowed, and stacked them with a strange sort of order, like a soldier still obeying rules no one else remembered. He lived alone, not in a home, but in the forgotten edges of the town, the alley behind Marcy's diner, the underpass near the rail yard. No friends, no visitors. Only a single photograph folded neatly in his inside coat pocket. Caroline, his wife, her smile forever young. Raymond had served 3 tours in Iraq, most notably in Fallujah. Bronze Star, Detty, 2 Purple Hearts. But no one in Fair Haven remembered the wars anymore, only the whisper that he once had them in him. Most crossed the street when they saw him. A few muttered. The bravest offered coffee in silence. And yet, one December morning, as he paused near the grocery store window, watching the bruised apples stacked beneath a flickering sale sign, something in his expression shifted. Hunger, maybe, or the faint, distant echo of something breaking loose inside. The grocery store was nothing special, just a squat, sagging building on the corner of Main and 5th, its cracked glass door propped open by a chipped concrete block, letting the cold December wind drift in uninvited. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and rotting produce. Raymond Carter paused, just beyond the threshold, shoulders hunched against the chill, his breath fogging the air in thin white streams. He didn't head for the counter, didn't speak to anyone. He simply lingered by the half-empty bins near the back, where bruised apples and day-old rolls lay tossed together beneath a faded sign. 50% off, no returns. His stomach twisted sharply. 3 days without a real meal had hollowed him from the inside out. His fingers trembled as he reached. Just one apple, just one roll, slipped quietly into the inside pocket of his jacket. He moved slowly, cautiously, as though still trying to preserve dignity, even while hunger drove him to the edge. But as he shuffled toward the exit, head lowered, the sound came. A sharp bark from across the store, loud enough to slice the air. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Mr. Paxton, red-faced and furious, was already striding forward, his boots pounding the linoleum. "You stealing from me, old man?" Carter stopped. Didn't run. Didn't explain. He turned, very slowly, and opened his mouth. But before a word could form, Paxton pointed to the phone behind the register. "I'm calling the cops," he snapped. "Right now." Carter didn't resist. He simply stood there, coat still buttoned, the weight of a bruised apple pressing faintly against his chest. Shoppers turned to stare. A mother tugged her child's arm and hurried away. The stock boy paused mid-stack, then went back to arranging cans. No one spoke. No one asked why. Within minutes, the red and blue lights pulsed against the frosted windows. 2 officers entered, one barking into his radio, the other scanning quietly. And then she saw them, dangling just beneath Carter's collar. Dog tags. Officer Lopez hesitated. "You served?" she asked softly. Carter gave the faintest nod. "Long time ago, when it still mattered. But rules were rules." She sighed and reached for the cuffs. Outside, under the cold afternoon sky, Raymond Carter was led to the squad car in silence. People stared. Others looked away. But no one stepped forward. No one said his name. And just before the cruiser door shut with a soft final click, Officer Lopez turned to glance back. Just once. Not with pity, but with something else. Something like recognition. Morning in Fair Haven Municipal Court arrived not with chaos or noise, but with that heavy, grinding stillness only bureaucratic indifference can create. Fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above a sea of worn tile, the air stale with reheated coffee and faded expectation. Raymond Carter entered without a word, his coat still damp from the alley's cold floor, his wrists chafed red from the cuffs, though no one had handled him cruelly, only as if he were already a file, already a formality. No lawyer waited for him. No family filled the gallery. No one even glanced up when he passed. He took his seat slowly at the defense table, hunched and still, like something placed there by mistake. The clerk read the docket in a monotone that flattened every name into the same shade of gray. Case 19-842. The State versus Raymond Carter. The prosecutor, young, sharp suit, no lines on his face, stood briskly. "Your Honor," he began. "The defendant was caught stealing food from Paxton's grocery. Footage confirms it. No address. Prior citations for loitering and public intoxication. The state recommends remand." As the words fell, Carter stood, not proudly, not defiantly, but with a tired motion that looked like surrender. He swayed slightly, knees fragile, but did not speak, did not plead. His eyes remained forward, steady, as if locked on something only he could see. Judge Thomas Whitaker barely looked up. Silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, fingers turning pages like clockwork. But then, something slipped loose. A dog tag, scratched and dulled, slid from the folder and hit the bench with a sound too soft for drama, yet sharp enough to cut through everything. Whitaker froze. He leaned in, his eyes fixed on the engraving. Carter R.J., USMC. A name, a blood type. And suddenly, he was elsewhere. Dust, fire, the smell of diesel and metal screaming. His jaw locked. 5-minute recess, he said abruptly, already rising. "Counsel, approach." The gavel didn't fall. The system paused, not for verdict, but for memory. 10 minutes passed. Then the doors opened again. But it wasn't the judge who walked in. It was a Marine in full dress blues, tall, still, and silent. His ribbons were precise, his boots clean as steel. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Every head in the courtroom turned as if pulled by gravity. The young prosecutor sat back, unsure why his spine felt cold. The Marine's eyes locked on Carter. Small, motionless, forgotten, and gave a single nod. Quiet, intentional. Then, without raising his voice, he said 6 words that shifted the entire weight of the room. "I'll be testifying on his behalf." No one asked who he was. No one needed to. Everyone knew what came next. The courtroom hadn't yet recovered from the silence left in the wake of the judge's sudden recess when the door opened again, not with ceremony or announcement, but with a quiet weight that bent the room's atmosphere inward, as if the walls themselves recognized the shift before anyone else could name it. A man stepped through, tall and broad-shouldered in his marine dress blues, ribbons sharp against the dark fabric, boots that struck the tile, not with aggression but with purpose, and though no one said his name, every head turned as if they already knew, because men like this do not walk into places like this without reason. Raymond Carter did not rise to greet him, did not even lift his eyes, his stillness more telling than any salute. But across the aisle, near the back of the gallery, a voice cracked the tension like a cheap lighter in a powder room. "Oh, come on," scoffed a man in a weathered brown coat, arms folded tight like they might shield him from what he'd just invited. "He steals from a store and now we throw a parade? I ought to call it what it is. Pathetic." It was Mr. Paxton, the grocer who had called the cops, who had dialed fast but looked slow, who now leaned back in his seat, as if his indignation granted him the right to rewrite the moment. The Marine's head turned slowly. His feet followed, deliberate, controlled, each step quieter than the last, and yet somehow louder in effect, because the entire courtroom seemed to pull back, to tense without twitching, as if they too knew the line between restraint and reckoning was beginning to blur. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He stopped directly in front of Paxton, not close enough to threaten, but just far enough to make it clear he wasn't here for conversation. And then, with a motion that felt more like judgment than confrontation, he reached into the inner pocket of his uniform, unfolded a single sheet of government paper with the slow precision of someone handling truth, and held it out, not to offer, not to ask, but to show. The page listed Raymond Carter's full military service record, every tour, every medal, every line that spoke of lives saved and sacrifices made, inked into federal memory long before Paxton had ever decided what counted as theft. "You called the police," the Marine said, voice steady, eyes fixed, on a man who once pulled his commanding officer from a burning vehicle under mortar fire, while bleeding from his own leg. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air held still. Paxton didn't blink. Not at first, but his jaw slackened slightly, the smug line of his mouth breaking under the weight of something heavier than shame. He looked at the paper, then at the man before him, and for the first time did not have a word to say. Because fear, when it arrives without fury, is far more final. Under the heavy weight of the judge's gavel, the courtroom fell into a hush so thick it felt like dust settling on old memories. And in that breathless silence, a boy no older than 17, nervous hands clutching a worn ball cap, rose slowly from the back row, his voice cracking not from fear, but from the unbearable gravity of truth he could no longer keep buried. "I saw it on the cameras," he said, every eye turning toward him like iron to a magnet. "He didn't just grab and run. He stood there, shaking, staring at that apple like it was the only thing left in the world. And when he took it, it was with shame, not greed. It was with shame, not greed." The words didn't boom. They didn't need to. They crept through the courtroom like water, seeping into cracks long forgotten, soft but unstoppable. All eyes turned to Mr. Paxton, who had once spat orders into a phone with righteous indignation, but now stood paralyzed, his mouth twitching as if to deny, to shout, to threaten. But no words came. His bluster had dried up in the face of something far more devastating than confrontation: clarity. His shoulders curled inward, his jaw clenched, but his eyes couldn't hold contact with anyone. Not the boy, not the judge, and certainly not with Raymond Carter, still seated like a stone in the riverbed, unmoved by the storm swirling around him. It wasn't the judge who moved next. It was the officer standing by the wall, silent until now, who stepped forward with quiet, deliberate gravity, a clipboard in one hand, the other resting near his badge. "We'll need a full statement, Mr. Paxton," he said, his tone not aggressive but immovable, and in that moment authority shifted, not with violence, but with undeniable weight. Paxton gave the smallest of nods, not in agreement, but in defeat. The kind of nod a man gives when he realizes the story no longer belongs to him. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. But the silence changed. The waitress from Marcy's lowered her head as if ashamed of the free coffee not given. A woman in the gallery wiped her eyes without knowing why. An older man, medals pinned to his jacket, exhaled through his nose with a sound that could have been anger or relief. And from somewhere near the door, a voice barely louder than breath whispered, "We should ved something." And when Paxton turned to leave, escorted not in cuffs but in the cold weight of being seen for what he truly was, the courtroom didn't speak, didn't move. They just watched. And Raymond Carter, eyes forward, face unreadable, didn't even lift his head to acknowledge the man walking out. He didn't have to. The reckoning had already arrived. As the heavy doors swung closed behind Paxton, the silence he left behind didn't dissolve. It settled, like dust over a battlefield after the last shot's been fired, thick and lingering, not of peace, but of reckoning. No one moved. No one clapped. And yet, something imperceptible had begun to shift. Not in noise, not in force, but in conscience. It was the kind of silence that doesn't end until someone breaks it with truth. A boy in the back row, who hadn't spoken a word the whole trial, pulled his hoodie down slowly and whispered to no one in particular, "I should have said something that day." His voice didn't reach far, but it didn't need to. A woman 2 seats over turned away, wiping her cheek with the back of her sleeve, and the waitress from Marcy's, who'd once slid Raymond cold coffee without a glance, was the first to rise. She didn't make a speech. She didn't cry. She walked the long aisle like she was walking through years of regret, and gently placed a paper bag on the table in front of him. "It's warm," she said, barely audible. "You don't owe me a word." He didn't give her one, just a nod, deep, slow, not of thanks, but of understanding. One by one, they came. The veteran who'd worn his medals like armor, but never once met Raymond's eyes. He took off his cap, pressed it to his chest, and gave a nod sharp and clean, like a salute without needing the form. A middle-aged man, who once crossed the street to avoid Raymond, now stepped forward and, without speaking, pulled from his coat pocket a fresh pair of gloves, still tagged, and left them beside the scarf already placed there. No one looked directly at each other, but everyone saw. The courtroom breathed. Long, heavy, and finally, human. Raymond didn't rise to receive them. He stayed seated, like a mountain, unmoved by the weather around it. His back straight, his boots planted, and his hands resting atop his duffel bag like a soldier resting between battles. But his eyes, they lifted, slow and steady, to the flag above the bench, creases worn, edges frayed, but still there, still hanging. And in that gaze was something more powerful than any verdict. Forgiveness. "We all come home in different ways," he said. Not loud, not forced, just spoken into the space like a truth waiting too long to be heard. The judge, still on the bench, said nothing, but his eyes were wet. The clerk looked down at her hands, and even the bailiff stood a little straighter, as if reminded of something he'd forgotten. Outside, the cold hadn't left, but it had softened. The wind still whispered through the cracks of the courthouse walls, but now it carried the scent of something new. Not redemption, not yet, but the first breath of it. And as Raymond finally rose and turned toward the door, there was no applause, no parade, only the sound of chairs scraping as every soul, who once looked away, now stood with him. And though no one dared speak it aloud, the message was unmistakable. Perhaps this place, once broken, had just remembered how to stand. 2 weeks after the courtroom fell silent, Fairhaven began to shift, not in grand parades or newspaper headlines, but in the soft, unseen ways a town whispers it remembers. Where Raymond had once stood with shackled wrists and a bowed head, now stood a brass plaque bolted cleanly to the courthouse wall, engraved not with apology, but with reverence to those who served and were forgotten until we saw them again. Until we saw them again. Beneath it hung a photograph, carefully framed, Raymond in uniform, standing at attention, the Pacific breeze lifting the corners of his collar, his eyes steady on a horizon no one else could see. It hadn't been ordered by the mayor or council. No speeches. No media. Just one morning, it was there. As if Fairhaven had woken up with the weight of its own silence and decided, wordlessly, to speak through gesture. Marcy's Diner, once a place where Raymond slipped through shadows, now kept a folded flag in a glass box behind the counter. A laminated note below read, "He never asked. But we remember." The waitress who used to glance away now refilled a cup labeled, "Raymond," before he stepped through the door. Raymond never said a word about any of it. He walked the same path each morning, boots softened by years, back straighter now. Not from pride, but from a gentler burden. Kids followed him sometimes, not mocking, just quiet, curious. One teenage boy, the same who once scoffed in court, now carried Raymond's groceries every Tuesday. He never explained. He just showed up and walked beside him. Silent, steady. At the high school, a young teacher invited veterans to speak. Raymond declined, but sat in the back row. A younger Marine took the mic, his voice shaking slightly as he recounted the day his convoy was ambushed, and a stranger with fire-blackened hands pulled 3 men from the wreckage. He never gave his name, the Marine said. But we remember the grip that didn't let go. Students didn't move. When the bell rang, not one rushed out. Later, essays appeared in lockers, drawings pinned to classroom boards. A mural behind the gym, painted by a girl who'd never spoken a word to Raymond, showed a battered duffel resting under an unfurled flag. The words beneath it were simple. Honor doesn't shout, it endures. Raymond passed the mural weeks later. He stood for a long while, shoulders still. Then slowly, with both hands, he took off his cap, not in salute, but in understanding. No one asked him to speak. They only watched as he placed his calloused hand on the painted flag, then turned and walked on, eyes forward. And that was enough. Because in Fairhaven, redemption didn't come from noise. It came from finally listening. The coffee shop was quieter than usual, tucked under the amber hue of a late afternoon sun. Time felt slower there, softened by the clink of a spoon stirring cream into a chipped ceramic mug and the hum of an old jukebox playing something distant and gentle. A tune neither man had requested, but both somehow needed. But Thomas sat across from his father, the table between them bare, except for 2 cups, and the silence that had once been an ocean and was now, perhaps, just a river. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. For the first time in years, words weren't required to build a bridge, just presence. Thomas's uniform jacket was folded neatly on the bench beside him. His sleeves were rolled, hands still calloused from years of service, fingers drumming slowly, rhythmically, like he used to do as a boy when waiting for his dad to come home. Across from him, Samuel cupped his coffee with both hands, the steam fogging his glasses slightly. His knuckles, weathered and scarred, trembled only when they reached to lift the mug. And when he set it down, he didn't look up, until Thomas finally said, barely above a whisper, "Didn't think I'd need you again." Samuel didn't smile, but his breath caught. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, and, with quiet deliberation, slid across the table an old Marine patch, faded, frayed at the edges, but still proud. Thomas picked it up with reverence, his thumb brushing the stitching. The light from the window caught the gold thread just so, and for a moment it seemed to glow between them. They didn't talk about the courtroom. They didn't mention the judge or the crowd, or the way the town had finally seen what it had long ignored. Instead, Thomas reached out and rested a hand on his father's forearm. No grip. Just wait. Just contact. Samuel didn't move away. Outside, a flag stirred lazily in the breeze, its edge catching the sun. Inside, the music faded into another song, one older, slower, almost sacred. A waitress passed by, but didn't interrupt. She refilled their cups without asking, then walked on. And as the clock above the counter ticked toward the hour, Thomas nodded once, slowly, and Samuel returned it. Equally slow, equally heavy. 2 soldiers, 2 generations. No words, just understanding. When they finally stood, neither pushed back their chairs with urgency. They rose like men who had carried weight, who now shared it. And when they stepped outside, it wasn't into applause or fanfare, but into quiet and peace. It didn't happen all at once. No grand parade, no headline, just small things, scattered like seeds in morning light. A librarian taped a yellowing newspaper clipping to the local history board, not because she was told to, but because she couldn't bring herself to file it away. It showed a grainy photo of Frank being led into the courtroom, then another, days later, of the judge standing at attention, eyes fixed forward like he'd just remembered something he thought had lost. At the town's middle school, a social studies teacher told her students, "Courage isn't loud. Sometimes it just shows up." No one needed to ask what she meant. The boy in the front row, who once laughed when a veteran forgot where he parked, now lingered by the flagpole after school. He picked the flag up one windy afternoon when it slipped from its line. No one saw him do it, but someone saw it standing straight the next morning. At church during Sunday service, Frank's name wasn't said out loud. It didn't need to be. A moment of silence stretched just a little longer. An old man in the back pew took off his cap, eyes glassy. Beside him, a young father nudged his son gently, and the boy stood straighter. Barbershops stopped their clippers when someone said, "You remember what happened to Frank?" Heads nodded. Mouths stayed shut. The silence said more than gossip ever could. People began to leave chairs empty in diners, not reserved, not labeled, but understood. Frank never told his story. He didn't need to. The story told itself, through the hands of a student sketching his likeness in the margins of her notebook, through the way a young deputy paused before cuffing an old man for trespassing, then let him go with a quiet, "Sir," through the wreath placed on his doorstep on Memorial Day, no note, just ribbon and respect. Some said he reminded them of someone they'd forgotten. Others said he reminded them of who they wanted to be. He didn't correct them. He just walked, slow and steady, like always. And when new families moved in and asked, "Who's Frank?" neighbors would look to one another, then gesture toward the old frame near the courthouse steps. "Start there," they'd say. "You'll feel it." In the local paper's editorial section, a teenager wrote, "I used to think respect was something you earned by speaking up. But maybe, sometimes, you earn it by staying quiet and standing tall." At sunset, the flag above town square snapped gently in the wind. Below it, a boy stood still, his hand raised in quiet salute. He didn't know Frank, but he knew enough. And that was how it spread, one quiet act at a time. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just paused at the edge of the sidewalk, the courthouse behind him, the flag overhead whispering faintly in the breeze. Frank Delaney stood still, back straight, boots rooted, cap in hand. The people who had once looked through him now stood behind him, heads bowed, hands clasped in front of them. Even the wind seemed to know this wasn't the time to move too fast. A little girl clutched her father's hand and looked up. "Was he the man?" she whispered. Her father nodded but said nothing. Inside the diner, the music had stopped. A single chair remained empty, a mug resting beside a folded napkin. Untouched, undisturbed. Above it, a photo framed in quiet pride. Frank in uniform, not smiling, not posing, just present. As Frank turned to go, a boy ran up. The same one who once stared in silence at the mural. He didn't ask for a story. He just handed Frank a small pin. "We made this," he said. "For you." Frank looked down, eyes misted but steady. He placed the pin over his heart and said the only words he'd spoken all day. "You don't owe me anything. Just carry it right." Then he walked off into the light. If you believe dignity lives in silence, comment honor to carry the memory. If these stories matter to you, for your father, your neighbor, or the man in line before you, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but for the lesson.